The story of the United Fruit Company is a story with two sides. On one hand, it's about the rise of capitalist superpowers with imperialist ambitions, and on the other, the rise of young nations with abundant resources, but with weak, incapable, or submissive elites. In North America, there was a fusion between the state and the major economic monopolies to intervene. Did they come in a coordinated way into the politics of the rest of the countries after the Rockefellers? One of the most significant stories that illustrates this phenomenon is that of the colossal consortium dedicated to the commercialization and production of tropical fruits brought from the Caribbean and Latin America, the so-called United Fruit Company. Coup d'etat in the region, like that of Jacobo Arbenz, control of governments and puppet presidents, monopolization of economic sectors, and attacks against humble peasants. They are part of the record that accompanies the 71 years of the controversial Fruit Company. Join us to learn about its origins, its great power, its main scandals, and its decline. This is Reynaldo José Carrillo Vilches. For those unaware, the new encyclopedia is now available in English and Portuguese. You can give us great support by joining both platforms, which you can find below, subscribing to both channels, liking the videos, leaving your comments, and watching the content, which has a lot of potential. Without further ado, let's start with today's video. The origins of the United Fruit Company, known by some as the Fruitera, go back to the last 3 decades of the 19th century in the United States. Tropical fruits were practically unknown in the United States. By 1870, it was no wonder, since trade with Central American countries was very limited, due to limited communication routes, and the hostilities of the jungle environment where those fruits grew. However, later, in 1870, Captain Lorenzo Dobaker brought from Jamaica a shipment of 160 bunches of bananas, which he sold in Jersey City for $2 per bunch. The American palate, never before accustomed to the sweet taste and smooth texture of the banana, made the sales of the exotic fruit a resounding success. This prompted Captain Dobaker to bring increasing amounts of bananas to trade in the United States. It was in Boston where the overly successful commercialization of this fruit led Dobaker to persuade Andrew Preston, who was an employee at a fruit trading company, as well as several of his fellow sailors, to create in 1885 the so-called Boston Fruit Company. In the next years, with Preston as sales manager and Dobaker as supplier, the shipments of bananas would be very profitable for the company, which by then was bringing fruit from Jamaica, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. However, the growing demand for bananas and other tropical fruits in the north made Preston and Dobaker look for partners to obtain more supplies of goods. At this point, the American businessman named Minor Keith appeared on the scene. At that time, he was a businessman, or rather a tycoon, who was building extensive railways in Costa Rica. He owned large tracts of land in that country where bananas, pineapples, and plums were produced. And at the same time, because of his great economic power, Minor Keith was someone who had negotiated Costa Rica's foreign debt with British bankers in exchange for several concessions and business advantages. We are at the end of the 19th century capital as a financial instrument, and factories are becoming the driving force of the economy all over the world. The economically and militarily strong countries are going to focus their capital and their geopolitics on the less powerful nations. All kinds of manufactured goods and products were exported to these less powerful nations, and in exchange, raw materials in minerals or food were received. Returning to the tycoon Mike Norkith, this businessman has several companies dedicated to growing and exporting tropical fruits to the United States. Several operated in Colombia, Costa Rica, Panama, Guatemala, and Honduras, and whose fruits were traded in New Orleans. These companies were equipped with extensive railways that cross the tropical jungles and agricultural plantations of these countries in the Caribbean or the rest of the American continent. By the end of the 19th century, Maynard Keith enters into negotiations with Preston from the Boston Fruit Company, and both see it as economically advantageous for the Boston Fruit Company and Keith's companies to merge. Therefore, on March 30, 1899, the new company, called United Fruit Company, is established in New York with a subscribed capital of $20 million and a stock offering equivalent to just over $1.6 million. When founded, the United Fruit Company was already established in 8 mentioned Latin American countries, and it also had under its control 112 miles of railways, 857,000 hectares of land, and a solid financial capital. It exported around 12 million bunches, for the simple reason that that was the number of bunches available to be exported. So from its beginnings, the United Fruit Company was already a strong commercial consortium that dominated most of the fruit market in the United States. In this way, the first 2 decades of the United Fruit Company's economic life were characterized by enormous economic growth. For example, the value of the company's assets in 1901 was almost $17 million, while by 1913 it was just over $82 million. Several factors drove the fruit company's rapid growth. The most fundamental was the union between the world's top capitalists and the major powers' foreign policy, especially the fusion that occurs between the large monopolies that were forming in the United States and the domestic and foreign policy of that government. That's how the United Fruit Company began, and many other American companies from different sectors, such as oil, petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, metallurgy, and the automotive industry. Do they coincide with the climax of the Second Industrial Revolution and with the adoption of an expansionist policy by the United States, whose government would work together with or sometimes subordinate to the main economic monopolies to dictate the policy of the so-called underdeveloped countries? Where would economic benefit be obtained through these corporations? And as a necessary condition for this scheme, the main decisions in those countries had to be subordinated to the United States through money, diplomacy, or directly through weapons. The boards of directors of these large corporations based in the United States and the United States government are thus gradually becoming almost the same thing. Going back to the early years of the United Fruit Company, the fruit company knew how to take full advantage of the growth of the United States fruit market. In addition, the company devoted itself to spending large amounts of money on advertising that it took care to spread. The idea that fruit, and especially the banana, was necessary in the basic diet of any human being. So the fruit company keeps following these monopolistic practices and becomes the owner of the entire process involved in fruit production. This also gives it significant power in the Caribbean and Hispanic American countries where it operated. Not just economic power, but also political power, as we'll see later. The fruits were grown on land owned by the United Fruit Company. These were also transported on the fruit company's own railways, where they were then shipped to United States ports on its fleet of ships, called the Great White Fleet, which at one point operated more than 100 vessels simultaneously. And from its warehouses in the United States, its own trucks left full of fruit for wholesale or retail consumption. This system allows the fruit company to save millions of dollars in transportation, marketing, and import costs, generating much higher profits. Alongside all of this, another factor that contributed to the growth of the fruit company was the continuous reinvestment they made in infrastructure in the countries where they operated, mainly in the railway networks, from their plantations to the ports. This was the fruit company's favorite project, not only to guarantee the continuous supply of their fruits, but also to monopolize the communication routes in the countries where they operated. Countries where, as we said, the company was becoming a key player in decision-making. Which brings us to another fundamental aspect. And the fact is that quickly, the United Fruit Company, in collusion with the United States government, would strengthen its ties with the governments of the Caribbean and Latin American countries where it operated, regardless of whether they were authoritarian or democratic, with the aim of penetrating their politics and governmental affairs. This was done with the purpose of obtaining favorable conditions for their operations, such as tax exemptions, exploitation rights, and other advantages. Historian Peter Chapman notes that the fruit company operated in countries that were technically and economically inferior. I quote, "There was plenty of room for corruption, in the sense that they could always bribe the central authority or favor a presidential candidate over another, having the money and resources to reach the center of power," end quote. It's about Caribbean or Latin American countries that are mostly being shaped this way. Practically owned by the American Fruit Company, that's where the term banana republics comes from. Beyond this, in the fruit company's first stage, from its 1899 founding to the late 1920s, the United Fruit Company had not yet come into the public eye for committing highly controversial and morally questionable acts, even for many Americans. However, the growing drive in the midst of the capitalist boom to consolidate multinational companies and take control of the markets would soon start to make headlines. The excesses for which the company would later become famous began with the so-called Banana Massacre, which took place between December 5 and 6, 1928, in Cienega, Colombia, during a strike by more than 25,000 workers of the fruit company who were demanding better working conditions and the recognition of laws in their favor. The strike, which paralyzed the production and export of bananas, was violently suppressed when the Colombian government, under the demands and pressure of the fruit company, sent troops to quell the protest. This resulted in an undetermined number of deaths, with estimates ranging from 47 to 1,000 dead. This was an early and fierce example of collusion, not only by the United States government, but also by Latin American governments with these large American corporations. But the United Fruit Company took an even more interventionist approach in the other countries. It will begin with a change in the company's internal structure, which happens as a result of the financial crisis of the year, 1929. To talk about this intensification in the fruit company's attitude, it's necessary to talk about Samuel Semurray. Semurray, also known as the Banana Man, was a Jewish-American magnate who owned a company that rivaled the United Fruit Company, called Cuyamel Fruit Company. This company operated in Honduras during the decade of 1910 to 1930. Samuel Semurray sells his company to the United Fruit Company for $31 million in shares and becomes one of the richest men in the United States. So by 1933, when the United Fruit Company was in a rather delicate financial situation, Semurray devoted himself to acquiring a large number of shares. Given the former board's millions in losses, Semurray uses his influence among the shareholders and his experience in the business, Fruitero, to take control of the board of directors and become the new president of the Fruitera. Presenting a new business model, Samuel Semurray's business model was going to be fundamentally oriented toward reducing costs and guaranteeing certainty and stability for the corporation. He emphasized the need to strengthen Fruitera's direct political intervention in the countries where it operated. The United Fruit Company began reinforcing abusive labor practices, including low wages, long hours, and poor conditions. At the same time, the company intervened politically in all the countries to prevent the establishment of unions and used intimidating tactics against its own workers. During the decade from 1930 to 1940, protected under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry Truman's Good Neighbor policy, a policy viewing the United States as the dominant ruler of the hemisphere. The United States maintained strong influence over Caribbean and Latin American governments via its multinational corporations. Political, military, and economic influence that kept the United Fruit Company protected so it could take these labor and wage measures in all those countries. Samuel Semery, the new United Fruit Company president, was already experienced. With his previous company, he had already significantly influenced the state of Honduras and was actively involved in the
Honduran politics.
And a great example of this is that by 1911, taking advantage of a climate of popular discontent against President Miguel Dávila, Samuel Semery orchestrated a coup d'etat in Honduras that resulted in Manuel Bonilla being installed as president. This move allowed him to obtain favorable concessions, such as tax exemptions and land rights, consolidating his monopolistic power over the country's banana industry. His ties to President Bonilla and other officials let him shape Honduras's political and economic decisions, creating a favorable environment for his operations. This 1911 case set the principle that governed the fruit company's operations for years. Thus, little by little, as the fruit company's capital grew, so did its violence, returning to this intensification of the company's monopolistic practices. Shortly after the change in management, the so-called Atlantic Banana Strike took place in Costa Rica, August 1934. The strike was marked by strong government repression under the demands of the American company. A preliminary agreement was reached on August 28th, but the fruit company didn't comply with its salary and labor terms, resulting in new protests. The repression results in the death of at least 300 workers amid precarious working conditions and a high level of political bribery. Will the fruit company last for decades more? However, the climax of the fruit company's influence comes in the 1950s with the support of President Dwight Eisenhower. During his term, he distinguished notable figures from American politics and government, including the president. They owned shares in the fruit company, including John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, and his brother Allen Dulles, CIA Director. Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, John Moore Cabot, who was the Under-Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, and many others close to the Eisenhower administration. They were part of the coalition between the state and big North American capital, and also directly owned shares in the United Fruit Company. So, when the Guatemalan president Jacobo Arbenz, in 1954, who had undertaken a historic agrarian reform that, among other things, expropriated several idle lands in the hands of the fruit company. When this president Arbenz changes the business and labor conditions and takes away, for a brief time, the monopoly on the production of tropical fruits in a very short period. The White House, the CIA, the State Department, President Eisenhower himself, and of course, the United Fruit Company. They put all their efforts into, successfully as they did, overthrowing President Arbenz and funding during and after a long media campaign against him. At the same time, the role of the fruit company also extends to financing destabilizing movements within Latin American countries, in line with the interests of big capitalists. An example of this is Fidel Castro, who on the eve and during preparations for the Cuban Revolution received funding through former President Carlos Prioso Carras from the CIA, closely linked to the United Fruit Company. The exact number is unknown, but it's estimated between 70,000 and 250,000 in weapons and equipment. But the monopoly of the United Fruit Company, which extended its influence to levels that have not yet been determined and was believed to last forever, began to decline. The decline of the fruit company began when Samuel Semery, who led the company to become that great banana giant, resigned in 1954, and he was succeeded by Elie Menage Black as president. Bad decisions, the The diversification of the fruit market and natural disasters on its plantations led the company to a financial gap in 1969, which Black tried to solve by selling it to Zapata Corporation, an oil company also owned by him. Later, he merged it with another corporation to form what became known as United Brands Company in 1970. However, the new company couldn't survive due to millions in debt. This difficult situation, along with a bribery scandal involving a payment to the president of Honduras, Oswaldo López Arellano, to abolish certain taxes, led Eli Black, the new president of the fruit company, to commit suicide on February 3, 1975. After Black's death, a new financial group bought the shares and formed Chiquita Brands International, which continues to operate to this day. Chiquita Brands, the successor of the once all-powerful United Fruit Company, is still dedicated to the production and export of fruit. Now, from the Central American tropics and other regions worldwide, with the Chiquita Brands logo, a smiling palenquera woman, typical of tropical regions, what was once one of the most powerful multinationals on earth has survived to this day. It led to over 70 years of interventionism. Bribery, poor working conditions, plots and intrigues that plagued the lands of several Hispanic American countries. The two sides of history, a people who oppress and a people who allow themselves to be oppressed. The economic, political, and social footprints of the United Fruit Company are still visible today, both in the collective imagination of the nations where it operated and in their economic reality. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Below you can find the new encyclopedia in English and Portuguese. Like all the videos on those channels, share them with your friends, check out the material that's really worth it, and, well, subscribe. Subscribe to both platforms. Thank you all and God bless you.